This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. On today's show, we're going to talk about how free markets and fashion design operate without very much intellectual property protection. Then my second guest is going to talk about something near and dear to the hearts of people in West Texas and across the Great Plains, tornadoes, and economic recovery after a tornado strike. My first guest is Dr. Ed Lopez. Dr. Lopez is Professor of Economics and BB&T Distinguished Professor of Capitalism at Western Carolina University. He is author of 2 books and is currently working on a book on the economics of the fashion industry. Ed, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great actually to talk about fashion here because we're so fashionable in our new
right.
studio. This is the first episode on the new set of Free to Exchange.
It's fabulous.
Fabulous in fashion. That's as close as we're going to get on PBS because we're not going to have models on the runway here unless you volunteer.
Yeah, we're all on budgets these days, aren't we?
Scarcity is a constraint.
That's right.
For economists. So let's talk about the fashion industry then. So it's kind of a unique industry in that there's a lot of innovation, but there's no intellectual or virtually no intellectual property rights protection. And a lot of people argue that without intellectual property rights, so by intellectual property rights, we mean copyrights and patents on things that protect other people from copying you, that people won't innovate in the first place. So what's going on here?
Well, it's a great question. It's one that I've been captivated by for a few years in my research. Let's start at the beginning. One is we have a little bit of intellectual property law protecting the fashion industry, especially with trademarks, your logos, your trademarked images that go on your handbags and so forth.
Right, so someone could copy the design of this tie, but they couldn't put that same label on the back.
Yeah, okay. Somebody could copy the overall shape of a Ralph Lauren shirt, but they can't take the little polo guy off of there and use that. That's protected by trademark. Now, from that we can say the usual argument for intellectual property is we need to have intellectual property protection in order to promote innovation. This is a very deeply ingrained concept. If you look at Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, it says in order to promote the sciences and the useful arts, Congress has the authority to give exclusive rights to those inventors and authors for a period of time. And that is the basis on which economists say that you need intellectual property protection in order to promote innovation. Well, come back to the fashion industry, we have very little intellectual property protection, no copyright essentially, no patents at all. But we have an industry that's demonstrably innovative. You have new designs coming along every single year. You have new designers that can be bold and rise to the top every single year. There's great variety in fashion over time and during each fashion cycle. Well, what's going on here? Well, obviously...
Well, what is going on here?
Yeah, obviously there's something else in play to promote innovation besides intellectual property law.
Okay. Well, what else is in play, Ed?
Okay, so in industries like fashion, where we can observe innovation in the absence of intellectual property, we have to say the designers are competing in ways that make intellectual property protection not as relevant. Well, one of the ways that designers compete with each other is to reference each other, or to put it more plainly, to copy each other. Now, copying, it turns out, actually is what moves innovation along in the fashion industry. New designs come along, if they're copied, that's going to be the trend. Copying helps establish which trends take off. Copying also makes a trend wear out, so it allows for new designs to have demand on a continual basis.
So like when we think of a famous designer, part of where their fame comes from is how much they're copied.
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
It's a measure of how influential, how successful, and ultimately how famous a designer is, the extent to which that designer is copied.
So does all this copying serve any useful economic function, or is this just, okay, so they still innovate, or the new designers still create new designs, and other people copy them, so there's kind of a transfer from one group to another, but society, who cares? Or is there a payoff?
I think that type of thinking is behind the reasons why copyists are so vilified. They're called pirates, they're called parasites, they're called even some worse names than that.
Shh, don't say those here.
Okay, this is a family show, right? So, but let's look at what flies in the face of those untoward comments about copyists is they do serve beneficial functions. One is they don't just merely copy designs, they also adapt along the way. And that's important because oftentimes the designs that they're copying are these sort of abstract things that come down the runway during Fashion Week, and people are like, oh my goodness, who would ever wear that?
Like when my wife makes me watch the Oscars or the Emmys or some horrible thing I hate, and I see all these people wearing clothes that I'm like, how do you wear those?
And those are oftentimes one of a kind, very, very expensive gowns. But that's the other beneficial function that copyists serve, is they're not just merely copying, they're also adapting in terms of finding ways to copy those designs at lower cost so that they can offer them in in segments of the marketplace where consumers have lower purchasing power, where they have bigger trade-offs to their consumer dollar and so forth. So copyists, number one, they make abstract designs more relatable to lots of people. And number two, the economics of it is they make fashion more accessible to wider and wider segments of the marketplace.
So they lower the cost and they innovate the product so that actually that uncomfortable thing you saw in Fashion Week becomes actually something
people want to wear.
You can wear and live with it. So I've got a quote here that I looked up from Stephen Colm, the executive director of the Council of Fashion Designers of America. And what he said is, designers invest a lot of time, a lot of resources, a lot of energy into creating their collections. It can take them 9 months and billions of dollars, which I was stunned to hear, billions of dollars. So when they present those collections and somebody can just steal them right off the runway within seconds and profit from their work, their energy, their intellectual property, it's just not fair. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that there is something to that. But let's take a look at why certain segments of the fashion design industry are clamoring for copyright protection. It's interesting. They don't go to Congress and say, and point to Article 1, Section 8 and say, we need copyright protection in order to promote innovation. They say...
You're showing there's plenty of innovation.
Yeah, as they would have a hard case to make because the fashion world is so demonstrably innovative. What they do is they go to Congress and they say, our designs are being used by other people in the marketplace. And we're investing a lot of our time and effort into creating these designs in the first place. It's not fair. What you need to do, what you, Congress, need to do is help us by being able to retain more of the fruits of our own labor and share less of it with others, first of all, the copyists, and subsequently the consumers who benefit from them. So it is a fairness argument. But fairness is subjective. From their point of view, they want to keep more of the fruits of their own labor. But if you look at the overall point of view, extending copyright to fashion designers would be destructive. It would interfere with the copyists, and therefore it would interfere with the beneficial functions that copyists serve.
So it's about extra rents for them at the expense of greater overall wealth for the rest of society.
It's a rent-seeking rationale.
I mean, if they really thought it wasn't fair, they'd stop playing the game, wouldn't they?
Yeah, so, or they would just play it better.
Yeah, it tells me that they're still getting rewards. So I wonder, are there lessons for other industries? Because IP is such a hot issue in music and technology and other things. Do you think there are applicable lessons from this for other industries?
I think there are. If you look at this sort of standard argument that IP is necessary to promote innovation, it kind of confines you to a single model of how creative expression works. So if you look at the music industry, over the last 15 years, the music industry has been subject to enormous pressure by copyists. Probably the first biggest instance of this was the company Napster, which allowed for consumers to share digital files of music with each other. Now, ultimately, Napster was closed down and it went all the way to a Supreme Court case. But what has been the influence on the music industry under this pressure of copyists? The music industry has had to reinvent itself and has become more dynamic in ways that have brought benefits to consumers. So for example, you have options now that don't involve buying an entire LP, bundled 10 songs together, some of which you like and some of which you're sort of not really fond of.
Usually I want one or two songs.
Yeah, one or two songs, and that's an option that we have today that we didn't really have so much 15 years ago. The music industry has changed to different models that were discovered because of the pressure that copyists put on it.
Because people were copying single songs off Napster and other things, they wanted a better way to compete. And started offering single songs on iTunes.
That's right. That's right. And it promoted more entrepreneurial innovation in how to deliver music to consumers than would have existed otherwise if there were no pressure from copyists.
I haven't read any scientific studies on this, but casual empiricism tells me there's been no shortage of new songs coming out over the last 15 years or so. Do does it seem like they're continuing to innovate just like the fashion designers?
Absolutely. I think that you can look at the total quantity of music being produced, and you can also look at the variety of music being produced. You also can look at the access to successful market sales by startup bands, by small acts that don't have a big record label. There are all kinds of innovative routes to consumers that have been developed, ultimately because of the pressure that copyists have put on the industry.
Wow, this is an interesting take at, I think, a point that a lot of people don't appreciate in terms of the IP debate that goes on, and they're just unaware of how little protection there is in fashion and how some of those lessons can apply to other industries.
Absolutely.
All right, well, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, provided a tornado doesn't hit the studio in the meantime, we're going to talk tornado economics, recovery. Stick around.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
You have a straightforward choice before you.
And you think I should choose life?
Come back here, Pookie!
We wanted to send Carl out by simply doing a good radio show.
Why start now, Peter?
Tell me what your understanding is of what happened.
Come on, step out of it, will you? You're on National Public Radio.
Once you become part of the Red Raider family, it's forever.
You know, Lubbock's just not a bad place to be or be from.
Are you really going to keep that?
That is so cool.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Daniel Sutter. Dr. Sutter is the Charles Koch Professor of Economics at the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy State University. Boy, that's a mouthful. He's previously taught at UT Pan American and at the University of Oklahoma. Perhaps that's where he got his first interest in tornado research. Dan, welcome to the show.
Ben, I'm glad to be on the show.
And I'm glad to have you because, let's see, I was meeting with you just about a year ago and first got the idea for this show because you host a show called E-Conversations at Troy State University.
Yes.
And interviewed me on it about my work on sweatshops when I came back here. I said, we should do something like that at Texas Tech. So thank you for the idea.
Well, I'm glad to have helped out, and I guess innovation spreads like that.
All right. Yeah. Well, this is all about the exchange of ideas, and I got hopefully a good idea from visiting you. So tell me, how did you first get interested in tornado research? Was it when you were at University of Oklahoma?
It started then, but I'd actually, from the time I was young, I was always quite afraid of tornadoes, and then I got a job at the University of Oklahoma. It was a good job, and I thought, well, I have to move there. I know that's the center of Tornado Alley.
Yeah, and you weren't originally from Tornado Alley. You were from Michigan, right?
Yeah.
So you've always been afraid of it, and then you moved to it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's definitely the fear that was involved there. I know if you start to learn and research more about something, sometimes it can help your fear. And I was particularly concerned about whether I should buy a tornado shelter.
Did you?
For my house. I didn't, because I did some research. That was the first research I was doing on tornadoes, and the numbers were such that I couldn't buy a shelter because then my colleagues would think like, well, you don't actually believe your own research. So.
You don't understand cost-benefit analysis and probability. Okay. So let's talk about the more recent research you've done on economic recovery from tornadoes. But first, I guess, something about it's the 2011 season that was just really an outlier in terms of the statistics on this, right?
It surely was. There was we had two signal events in that year. There was a big tornado outbreak across Alabama and the southeast on April 27th, and then about a month later, on May 22nd, a F5 tornado struck Joplin, Missouri. The April 27th outbreak involved the most tornadoes in one 24-hour period in U.S. history, or at least reported tornadoes. And the Joplin tornado was the deadliest tornado in the United States since 1947.
Wow. And so this Joplin tornado, I mean, what type of damage was done? How many people lost their lives in this?
It was a devastating tornado. It tracked the path length was 22 miles overall, but that was basically right across the central part of the Joplin, Missouri. There was about $3 billion of damage, which was the most damaging tornado in history, and 158 direct fatalities plus 4 indirect fatalities from the tornado. As I said, the highest death total in any tornado since 1947.
Wow. But now, the happy side of this, though, is that there's been a fairly rapid recovery in Joplin, right?
Yes, and so what we were interested in at the Johnson Center was taking a look at how recovery occurred from this tornado. The Mercatus Center, George Mason, had done a large project looking at recovery from disaster in the aftermath of Katrina. Mm-hmm. So Katrina was the deadliest hurricane to strike the United States in decades, and this was the deadliest tornado to strike the United States in decades. And so I thought there was sort of a nice parallel to, well, why don't we see how things were different, or how they were, maybe if there were any lessons learned in the 6 years between Katrina and Joplin.
So how were things different? I mean, New Orleans was a mess.
Right. Well, in many ways, a lot of things were similar. If you look at like the private sector and the voluntary sector of society, we had the same vigorous response of the private sector to the tornado in Missouri that we saw in Katrina as well. And that was both through the business sector and then through the nonprofit sector. In the business sector, there were 500 businesses that were damaged or destroyed in Joplin during the tornado, including like the hospital, which was the largest employer in the community. And very quickly, most of these businesses announced that they were going to rebuild. The large employers were going to rebuild, and that helped prevent any population loss that occurred. Walmart and Home Depot rebuilt their stores there in a very fast fashion. And again, Walmart transferred many of their employees to their other store that they had in Joplin, or offered them employment in other Walmart stores around the country so they could keep them on payroll and they didn't lose their jobs.
Now, I remember from Katrina the episodes of price controls being imposed down there. I remember a particular case of someone who had a U-Haul that he rented in Tennessee or something, and he bought all the generators he could from Home Depot, and he drove them down. I think he was actually in the Mississippi part of it, and he was trying to sell them, for a 500% markup or something, and the police arrested him for it because he was price gouging. And then actually they impounded the generators, so nobody got the generators. I don't know who that helped. But were there instances of price gouge or anti-price gouging laws being enforced in Joplin, or did market forces get to allocate resources
We
better?
didn't see any real evidence, because we came in a few months after the tornado, so we weren't on the ground in the media after.
Right, but you were talking to people.
Yeah, we came really across no evidence of large price rises in the aftermath. And certainly Walmart and Home Depot have policies that they don't raise their prices in the aftermath of disaster. So they're
PR
large enough.
Bad economics.
They're also large enough, I think they can avoid that, that they can absorb the costs across their nationwide operations. Plus also they would probably be too inviting targets for prosecution under these laws if they did raise their prices too much. So
Sure, but at the same time, there's some guy who's going to Walmart who's not raised their prices, who's buying a generator to run some trivial stuff when somebody else really needed that generator more, right? So Walmart's feeling good and doing good public image, but not necessarily helping people with this policy.
They've learned a lot about what people need, and it's one thing we did notice in Joplin is that they took special steps to assist their customers. So, for instance, Walmart normally doesn't sell bedding, like mattresses or major appliances. But in the aftermath of the tornado, they were special ordering in both mattresses and appliances because there was such a demand in the community, and to help people get them quicker. Of course, they were selling them. But
there's a profit incentive, right? Hey, a bunch of people need beds. Let's bring in some beds.
Yes. So, but and again, it's not something they normally do. But they recognize the demand in the community, and at least for the near term, they were willing to, in effect, special order and help meet the demand.
Now, how about, so a lot of people contrast of, it's either going to be markets or government, but it's really not that dichotomy. There's kind of three things. There is a dichotomy, the voluntary sector and the coercive sector. So, but within the voluntary, we have the market and civil society,
right,
where people aren't getting paid to trade. They're just doing the right thing of helping their neighbors. Was there a lot of civil society rebuilding going on in Joplin too?
Sure, there definitely was. In the I think the 7 months after the tornado, there were over 90,000 volunteers came to the community to help out.
Wow.
There were over 100 homes rebuilt in the first, I think, 8 months afterwards, funded by different private foundations, including ABC's Extreme Makeover Home Edition, which had a special rebuilding segment in Joplin. I think they
with a little profit incentive on the side there. They're getting a TV show out of it.
Yes, but for the 5 families who had their homes rebuilt for them, that was a good thing for them. In our research, we came across a group called Samaritan's Purse, and they provide a lot of different assistance, both in the immediate aftermath, and then they also help people who were underinsured, homeowners who didn't have enough insurance to be able to fully rebuild their homes. And that they come in and they have volunteers that come in and help rebuild the homes. And so through their volunteers and their donations, they help folks out in that fashion. But they also screen the people that they provide assistance to with quite a bit of background checks, and then since the people are there helping the volunteers rebuild their homes, I think they get a real sense of pride and ownership in what they're doing.
So with our last few minutes here, let's talk about the other sector then, government. Mm-hmm. What was government's role in this recovery versus the private enterprise, civil society sector? And how is government different here than, say, the mess that it was creating in Katrina?
Well, we saw this is the part that was different, is that we saw a much more cooperative or accommodative response from government. I think in the city of Joplin, they were focused mainly on helping people recover, and they saw it as a private sector activity that was going to occur, and they took much more of a hands-off approach.
So they just provided the framework and protected private property from being raided or pillaged or something?
Yes, and then also tried to restore government services. So, I mean, one of the specific things that helped out was that you had all these businesses that were disrupted. Many of them were service-based businesses like insurance or accounting services. And people were able to keep those businesses going, operating out of their homes. Mm-hmm. If you strictly applied a zoning law, then you could shut down those home-based businesses, but they were waiving that. They were also very accommodating and trying to get building permits issued and inspections taken care of as quickly as possible so that people weren't facing unnecessary delays. And the government also didn't step in and attempt to, I think, centrally plan or direct the recovery in any way. We also saw some evidence that FEMA responded in a little different fashion. One of the things that happened after the Katrina is there's a reorganization act that was passed requiring FEMA to have a liaison with the voluntary organizations that assist in disaster. And so we found some evidence that was working out as a profitable partnership.
So I think implicit in your last answer might be part of the answer to this, but I'll ask you anyway as kind of my final question to you then. So my wife and I and kid have moved to Lubbock, Texas, and of course Lubbock had a major tornado in the 1970s that did a lot of damage here. What would your advice be to Lubbock officials, in like 1 minute or less, your advice to Lubbock officials of how to deal if a major tornado comes through?
Try to keep the hands off to the extent you can. I think allow people to rebuild. I think we see that consistently, that people, their first reaction is to try to rebuild. And people have had their lives disrupted, sometimes destroyed, and the thing they want to do is recover and get back to as close to normalcy as they can. And I think it's our moral duty to not get in their way and let them repair their lives as quickly as they can. They've already been injured. Don't insult them further by delaying their recovery.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dan. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's show. On the first part, I was fascinated to learn about the fashion industry and the type of innovation that they have there, despite not having intellectual property rights protection. It makes me wonder what other industries maybe are overly protected in IP, whether it's in technology or pharmaceuticals. Maybe that's a topic for another show. Then the second half, I feel a little bit better hearing from Dr. Sutter about tornado recovery and how well it worked in Joplin when the government let the private sector and civil society be flexible enough to solve these problems. Hopefully, other officials in Tornado Alley are paying attention too. See you next time.